How are we doing today? Okay, so I'm going to need just a little bit of feedback, or else I'm going to keep talking, and you don't want that. So the title of my session here is "Do You Trust Me?" And so informal poll. You know, I'm the guy dressed all in black. You know, I'm the one hacker guy. I've got some imagery in my slide deck. Who here trusts me as a computer researcher? You know, with your payment data and all those things. Well, good. We've got one person that I'm going to profit from later on today. But the bottom line is we're in a situation with the state of security on mobile platforms that you actually have to, as an app provider, take a little bit of trust out in your end user and hope that they don't do some of the things that are very difficult to detect once you're outside of the wall. So I'll start with a couple of quick statistics to give you sort of the state of the union from where I sit. So there was a study done about a year and a half ago which took a look at all of the mobile banking applications or payment applications in the major Android app stores, and did some automated scanning, looked inside for what the guts, what the program, what the business logic was doing. And they found that up to 11%, right around 11%, had something in there which pretty much was suspicious to the level of knowing that the company that created the app didn't put that in there. It was something that had been added on, repackaged, placed back into the app store to give an attacker a leg up on being able to take credentials, do fraudulent transactions, or suspicious web sort of code. And then on the other side, the detection side, there was actually 7.2 million detections of mobile malware in 2016. A lion's share of that was towards the banking applications, towards the payment applications of different types of attacks, whether that be the overlay attack where you're trying to steal credentials and then a two-factor token, or the redirection attack where you actually are forced to do transactions that you're really not even knowing about as the end user. But it sort of begs the question: why do we trust mobile devices? And the answer, by and large, at least from an industry standpoint, seems to be convenience. It's what the customers are asking for. Everybody has that ubiquitous smartphone in your pocket, and in a rush to fulfill that market, a lot of shops have kind of changed their security stance and their security policy. A long time classic information security. We've got that strong perimeter where nothing ever goes outside of that, but that just can't be true anymore, because there's this ubiquitous device that always knows exactly how to get back inside your perimeter, right? We build the apps to talk to our APIs that go back through the web firewall that access the resources on the inside. But so if there's anybody here from one of the major mobile platforms, I will happily discuss this next statement offline with you. But the really inconvenient truth is that the security controls that the operating system has put in place is generally not designed specifically to protect the app providers or the banks or the institutions. That is not the point. The point is to protect the integrity of the platform, right? Which is a slight difference, but it's an important difference when you're talking about your security posture as an institution. When I'm talking about these security controls, operating systems like Android and iOS are very strong in sandboxing away from other processes, and keeping the data secure once it's in a key or an enclave. But that's often not the threat vector that an attacker of a banking application is going to want to take. So from your institution's perspective, you sort of have to think through the process of risk and what mechanisms enforce app integrity, for example. Can an end user take my pristine code banking app, even if it's coded perfectly? Think about that for a moment. Anybody have a perfect development team out here? No, that's never yeah. Oh, good. Let me know who that is, and I'd love to talk to you about them. But we assume you can assume that you still perfectly code the app, right? Your business logic is flawless. But the problem is that you still are leaking information the moment you throw code out into an untrusted environment. The attacker is going to know these things and be able to change it because it's code running on their device, right? But what mechanism enforces app integrity? The operating system. It's the one that checks the code signature. It's the one that makes sure things are unchanged. What mechanisms prevent repackaging? The short answer is there is none. We're in sort of a situation, where natively you can, liberate an app from a device, change it, and then re-upload it back to the store without a lot of problem. So, there is no mechanism that prevents repackaging natively in the OS. What mechanism prevents IP leakage? Your app needs to talk to APIs in the backend in a certain specific way with certain parameters and certain things like that. What prevents an attacker from taking the code, looking at it, disassembling it, and knowing exactly how your APIs work? The answer is nothing natively except for the operating system. How about protecting network usage? It's another in the situation that the operating system protects their interests, the interests of the platform and the fraudulent behavior on that platform, but they don't actually protect the app provider with the operating system. All of these mechanisms, if you pull the domino or the Jenga piece out of the bottom here and create a compromised version of the operating system, all of these mechanisms fall almost immediately. So it sort of begs the question, why are we not, as for InfoSec professionals, as security risk management teams, why are we not treating this like a hostile environment, which is really what we should be doing? So, just to drill down a little bit more, if the code knows, you have to assume the attacker knows too. If the code performs an operation, whether that be an API transaction, whether that be a cryptography operation, you have to assume that with a sufficiently powerful attacker, they could go step by step, instruction by instruction, through that code and figure out exactly what's going on. That's the risk model that I'm really strongly urging people to think about and adopt. Because once you have this map for how your APIs work, then it becomes sort of a trivial operation to go and either create banking applications which are counterfeit in some way, or payments applications which are redirecting payments into the wrong place. We've seen a lot of this in the news over the last 2 years, where people have compromised specific pieces of software, sometimes even inside the perimeter, to sort of accomplish this this movement of payments outside of their normal realm. And so if you assume that if I'm inside the perimeter, it's protected, you sort of lose this this sort of nuance that all of the applications that you throw outside of the perimeter know exactly the key, right? They know how to talk to your insides. And so if an attacker can use that and permute on it and then try to discover what else is in there, you have to remember that this is directly inside your app already. And so you should assume that the app has the capability to do that. And so what does that actually mean? What can you do? The biggest thing that you see is the risk of decoupling API calls from the app. So now, maybe it's not a banking application, right? Maybe it's a different application that somebody would download that's fraudulent in some way. And what you'll see is that if somebody knows, the credentials, if somebody knows how to, call the login APIs or the transactional APIs directly from, without using the app, what they do is they embed that in some other piece of code. And then you have that lateral movement of malware, that lateral movement of fraud to places where it wouldn't even be expected by the end user. I mean, so we get to this moment here where I have to sort of tread lightly because it's a very easy rejoinder for our security teams to say that users are dumb, right? We've all heard that, right? The problem exists between the keyboard and chair, or a mobile device and pocket, I guess now is the better way to say it. But really, what we need to treat that as users are a risk to the enterprise. And we need to treat them appropriately by giving them the proper amount of access, the proper amount of scrutiny, the proper amount of buy-in from their actions. Not just the transactions that they do, but the surrounding actions of what you see what their patterns are, what their usage parts are. And there's usually a problem here because you sort of don't get that picture from inside the code that you've deployed out to the wild. You don't see that full picture inside the binary. And so, that's a really big risk of, sort of decoupling the guts of your application from the app and seeing where that lands out in the real world. And then obviously the other big risk here is impersonation. The point where every banking app that we saw had at least 5 or 6 variants that were fairly easily pickable in the App Store, which had very somebody that wasn't paying a lot of attention could they get knocked down and picked up very quickly, but you could absolutely download a banking application which is not the one that you think you're doing. You might be logging in to your bank, but it's not actually your bank. And then they use the API knowledge to forward on all of those credentials back and forth. So in the back end, you don't see anything because it looks like it's normal, but the attacker is actually sort of sat on all these credentials, all these tokens, right in the middle of the whole process. And so you have this risk of impersonation. And a lot of times, what the malware will do is actually just draw right over the login forms, right? Where it's actually just putting a window that looks just like that. In many cases, they're actually using the code of the application themselves. So they're using your code to draw something over your application to have a mal effect. And so it sort of begs the fact that if you can sort of decouple all these pieces and parts of the software as an attacker, you have this toolbox ready-made to be able to attack the app with the app's contents itself. And so, let's talk a little bit about what sorts of things I'm specifically referring to. Number one, first and foremost, is OS compromise. The root of the jailbroken devices allow a user to have privilege above, far above and beyond what your normal user would do. This is a huge red flag. And so if you're not doing anything to sort of correlate that back with your risk management, I would highly suggest reviewing that policy, because you see that the attacks that happen, there's almost always either a root or a jailbroken phone at the bottom of that. Once the attacker has that compromised device, what they do is they attach something called a disassembler, where they take the actual bits and bytes of your code and they turn it back into human readable source code. And what that does is it exposes your business logic in a way that it could be analyzed from end to end. It could be taken apart looking for vulnerabilities. If there's any cryptography keys or specific ways that the APIs are being accessed, that's all there. It's ready for you. It's as an attacker you get to see it. When we have the debuggers, that's getting down to the level where you can actually modify how the code is running at runtime in a live way. Very powerful attack for a debugger or for an attacker, because what you can actually do is you can see transactional data live as it's going through the application. And then we get to the point where you sort of convert your attack into a real world malware sort of attack, where you take the code, you modify it, you re-sign it, and then distribute it. And using things like phishing or a clickjacking attempt to get a user to download and input one of these applications. And then runtime compromise is a huge part of this too, where you can actually have one app affecting another, as assuming that it has administrator or root abilities on the phone. So what does this mean? This is gloom and doom and everything's terrifying. It sort of calls out a hole in our strategy. It calls out the fact that we have been relying on the defenses of the operating system, the defenses of sort of encryption and these good practices for a long time, but we haven't been treating our target as hostile. We need to build an internal defense so that you can not only rely on the APIs, the mechanisms that are provided to you by the operating system, but also start to build confidence in the patterns of behavior, in the technologies that a user is using against your program, and then report that back in a way such that you can sort of connect it with your existing risk management. That's the big part here, is that, for a long time, our stance on sort of building that internal defense was, rock solid, we don't need anything, our wall is strong. But over time, we have seen so many examples of when you have, subtle reporting that comes back and corroborates the actions that a user's taken. I think I lost that. The actions that users taken with the APIs, you can actually corroborate that with the different actions that they've taken with the application, where you see, certain important pieces of functions being called, and those are then, translating into different actions that the user's taken with communicating to your backend. And being able to correlate those things, just like with all of the other, metric data that you're already collecting, is so much more of a powerful thing where you can connect the actual picture of what the application is doing with what the user's doing in the end. And often that you'll see that exhibits very specific patterns when somebody's doing something fraudulent or suspicious. And so it becomes incumbent on a sort of a need to build a little bit more robustness from inside the application, not just assuming that the operating system has your back. Because once the idea here is, I started this off with, do you trust me? And the end of that sentence is, I hope you don't have to at the end. When the operating system is not the only thing that has your back, when you actually start to defend yourself from an application and a cryptography perspective, do you trust me as a researcher? It really doesn't matter because you're not treating it like that anyways. Great. So thank you very much. I'll take any questions about perspective on application level security or anything. If you want some more specifics, I try to keep this fairly high level, but I'd be happy to talk bits and bytes with anybody here that would like to. But I'd take any questions if anybody has any. Please.
In your list of steps there, you said re-signing the application.
Yes.
And you take it apart. So the purpose of signing the application was supposed to be to make sure that nobody tampered with it. So how does the re-signing work?
So that's a great question. The question was, how does the re-signing of the application actually help distribute the app? And the answer is, attackers will come up with a space in the different app stores, and they'll sign it with their own certificate. So all of the signing mechanisms that exist both for Android and iOS can actually be easily and trivially replaced just by a command line tool. It won't be with the original signature of the institution that you're talking about, but it will be signed with the attacker's signature, which if it's a valid App Store account, will not throw up any problems for the end user. It'll just work if they download it from the App Store, which they've trusted. But the bottom line is that it's more incumbent on the App Store. Once the end user has trusted one of those app stores, you implicitly trust all of the signatures from that app store. And so if you replace that as an attacker and you get it distributed in a valid app store, the end user will never see any difference. Good question. Thank you. Anyone else? Great. Well, please stop by and talk to me at the Arxan booth if anybody has any further questions or more technical issues they'd like to get into. But I thank you for your time and have a good rest of the conference.